Throughout cinema history, there has been no greater rivalry than between two entities in particular, Godzilla and King Kong. Their histories overlap, their timelines are parallel, they react to each other as they go throughout time. And in this viewing guide, we're going to talk about every Godzilla movie and series, and every King Kong movie and series, and going through their history to show the parallels between them. This is the Godzilla x Kong viewing guide. It's morphin' time! Special shout out to all our channel members, including our Captain Tiers, Infinity Wartorn, Spin-54, Super Shaddix Boom, Toma K, Jamie's World, Matthias Laura, Don Don Ranger Power, Donnie Waldman, Dr. Grid, Jeremy Carr, It's La Dorman, Toku Texas Cosplay, Common Pikachu, Satargo's the Kaiju from Krypton, Brendan Overland, and AMG and Marco 27. If you'd like to support the channel, hit the join button down below for more details. Hello, this is Soundout here, and welcome to the Godzilla x Kong viewing guide. This is going to be your guide through every Godzilla movie and show and every Kong movie and show, in chronological order by group. You'll see what I mean as we go along what that weird sentence actually says. But this, like I said, is a rivalry that has been eternal through the history of cinema, beginning with 1933's King Kong and 1954's Godzilla. There's a lot of parallels between two different creatures who have societal commentary while having destructive rampages, and really are the true monsters humanity themselves. These themes are central to both franchises, and Godzilla definitely took inspiration from Kong, and later on Kong would take inspiration from Godzilla. And that, I think, is what makes them so interesting as a pair. And especially with newer films like Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, it's showing how putting these two together excites audiences across the globe. And so because of that, because of New Empire coming out, I thought, let's track the history of both series and the both characters' histories, where they overlap and also where they stay separate, because I think that would make it for an interesting experience. I have done multiple viewing guides on this channel already, so check out those others when you finish this one if you want more insight and guidance throughout multiple large franchises. But this video is going to be focusing on Godzilla and Kong, but also the related films around them. So there's going to be a little Mothra, there's going to be a little Rodan, it's going to be everything you need to know about each specific point in time. However, it will not be necessarily explaining what these movies are, because again, I feel like King Kong and Godzilla are sort of self-explanatory, and a lot of these movie titles are very literal, so I'm only going to be worried about the order they go in, less so than what order, what they are about. So if it piques your interest based on the poster, give it a shot. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you don't have to listen to this order of events here. Like, I'm going to list all the Godzilla films from the 60s and 70s, and there's a lot of them, but if you just are like, Godzilla vs. Gigan looks cool, just jump in right into Godzilla vs. Gigan. That's totally valid. And honestly, you can start with any of these movies in any places. But if you're wanting to know what movies connect together, this is going to be the guide for that. In addition to this, we are going to talk about TV shows that connect, though not every single TV show. Godzilla has a lot of shows that are like little shorts, and we're leaving those out because I don't feel like those are super relevant and they work standalone anyways. But with all that said, we got a lot to get through, and we're going to chronicle the history of these two titans of cinema. So if you want to make sure this video gets out to more people, please hit the like button, and please hit subscribe and the notification bell if you haven't already. Appreciate the support to continue doing more guides like this. But let's begin our history with 1933's King Kong. Our story begins in 1933 with King Kong, a film that is not just revolutionary for the sake of it being a movie about a giant ape who is from an island that gets pulled from that home and taken to New York City where disaster occurs, but for the fact this is essentially the first giant monster movie. For all intents and purposes, this is the one that kind of spawned a giant monster genre, even if Kong is not as large as some other monsters we see in the future, like Godzilla. But this film is also important for establishing things in the medium that didn't exist yet for film, because this was such early days. This is one of the earliest uses of stop-motion animation, meaning it essentially created the stop-motion animation medium, especially being used in conjunction with live-action material. It is revolutionary for a lot of special effects artists and filmmakers who look at this as a huge inspiration for how their films came to be. It is, without a doubt, one of the most important movies ever made. And that is always going to be King Kong's title, because this has influenced things even outside of genre storytelling, because King Kong is that iconic. This film itself is something I think that if anyone is interested in giant monster movies or the history of them, you must watch this movie, because it is important to see the history. It may not be your favorite Kong movie or your favorite monster movie at the end of the day, but it is such a landmark film itself. And the film has luckily been available on DVD, Blu-ray, VHS, Laserdisc, all formats you could imagine, and of course digital purchase and streaming. So if you're looking for it, it shouldn't be too hard to find, especially since the movie's approaching 100 years old in a few years. This is a film that I highly recommend you check out, because it is definitely worth the experience. Now, this film was such a success, and then it came out in April 1933. A sequel came out in December 1933 called Son of Kong, aka the people in the first movie found out what happens after you mess around with things you shouldn't. It actually follows up on a lot of things you might have questions for from the ending of King Kong. If you liked King Kong, Son of Kong is going to be right up the alley. This film has been released on DVD, Blu-ray, VHS, streaming, etc., though it's sometimes a little bit harder to come by than the original King Kong film, so you may have to look for it a little bit harder, but it's a worthwhile addition. Now, there is other movies in this area that star giant apes, but they aren't officially King Kong movies, so I think it's time to pass the baton over to King Kong's rival, Godzilla. 1954's Godzilla is another iconic film in cinema history. It certainly changed the landscape of Japanese filmmaking and established giant monsters into the tokusatsu medium that was starting to burgeon and become its own at this time. It is an iconic film. It is a story about the dangers of humanity using nuclear weapons. It is a story about humanity as its own monster. There is a lot of themes and elements that are in this film that have carried forward to every adaptation of Godzilla and several adaptations of monster films to this day. But it does take some of its own inspiration from King Kong in a lot of man versus nature and man shouldn't mess with nature storytelling, plus the fact that there is a giant monster. However, unlike King Kong's stop motion animation, Godzilla used a suit actor in a Godzilla suit in a miniaturized city to portray its monster. And that is kind of a thing that became such a regular thing that a lot of tokusatsu fans love and know, from Ultraman to Sentai to Kamen Rider, etc. I think this is an iconic film that everyone should watch if they're into giant monster movies and giant monster movie history. And I can say that with both King Kong and Godzilla, which is why I think we so much pair the two together. King Kong is very much a Western approach to this idea, where Godzilla is more of an Eastern approach to the idea. But both of them have universal themes that work globally, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating and why we are so attached to and follow these giant monsters, why we're so absorbed by the stories. Now, if you're looking for the original Godzilla, much like the original King Kong, pretty easy to find. It's had solo Blu-rays, DVDs, Laserdisc, VHS. It's on streaming and digital. There is a lot of ways to get it. There also is the Criterion Collection Godzilla Showa Years box set, which is more like a book set, that has the film as well. So it's regularly available. Now, there is an American adaptation of this in 1956 called Godzilla King of the Monsters, which had new footage inserted with an American actor to make it appealing to American audiences with the English dub of the film. That is an iconic version, though I highly recommend checking out the original, just because that's usually how I roll with things. This will also be the last American adaptation I'm going to mention, because it's the only one that's regularly available, whereas others are harder to find. This also was essentially the first American adaptation of a Japanese production, which is something that would happen later on with things like Battle of the Planets, Voltron, and of course, Power Rangers. Now, this film was so successful and so iconic, it spawned a series of sequels and an extended universe that I'm referring to as the Toho Showa universe, because there's a lot of movies here, and a lot of these are very self-explanatory based on the titles, but I really want to focus in on the order to watch them because it can be a little confusing. There's a lot of resources out there will just put the Godzilla movies in order and not include the other kaiju, which for the most part is fine, but you miss out on things like the first introductions of Rodan and Mothra. So let's go in order for how these films should be watched if you want to see everything chronologically. First up, 1955, Godzilla Raids Again, aka Godzilla's Counterattack, direct sequel to Godzilla 1954. This one is on the Criterion Showa set and should be available on streaming pretty regularly. 1956's Rodan, or Giant Monster of the Sky Rodan, is the introduction to the Rodan monster and is Toho branching out to other monsters. And Rodan is a regularly appearing character in Godzilla. The film has seen DVD releases over the years, but most of them are out of print, so it's going to be a little bit hard to find because I don't think it's currently licensed anywhere. In 1957, we have The Mysterians, also known as Earth Defense Force in Japan. This is another film that's kind of expanding and elaborating on the kaiju subgenre. 1958's Varan the Unbelievable, also known as Giant Monster Varan, sees a different type of flying kaiju. And Varan is something that would sort of almost become part of the Godzilla mythos in a lot of ways, but is part of the original mythos in its own continuity. 1961 was Mothra, the introduction of the character Mothra. This is the origin, where the establishment of Mothra begins. It's a very essential film. I think more so than some of these other movies, Mothra and Rodan are kind of your base bone things for characters that appear with Godzilla a lot. It also had a Blu-ray release and is more available than some of the other things. It's had a recent release, unlike Rodan. 1962's Gorath, also known as Ominous Star Gorath, sees an ominous star named Gorath. Then in 1962, something very interesting happened. King Kong vs. Godzilla. This was produced by Toho, featuring the character of King Kong in their own interpretation, fighting Godzilla. And this movie would get picked up for American distribution and altered for various reasons due to copyright holders wanting King Kong to look better than Godzilla. So if you're looking for the original Japanese version without the edits, your options are the Criterion Showa Era Blu-ray box set, as it is a bonus feature on here, or you'll have to look elsewhere. They don't like to let this one out because Universal is very protective of Kong, even though they only ever produced one King Kong movie. Following from there, 1963's Matango introduces the fungus monster Matango, and 1963's Atragon, also known as the undersea warship, introduces the concept of humanity having submarines and weaponry to fight against monsters themselves, something we would see in future Godzilla films. 1964's Mothra vs. Godzilla really does start to establish the Godzilla fights a monster formula, though in this case, Mothra got top billing, so good for her, get that bread, girl. But the thing I like about this film is that it kind of establishes what we'll see for the rest of the Showa era, which is kind of like Godzilla versus Monster. And this film was available with the other Godzilla films on the Showa Blu-ray box set and streaming. 1964's Dogora, also known as Giant Space Monster Dogora, introducing a giant space monster. Like I said, these titles are very literal. And the third 1964 kaiju film from Toho, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, also known as Three Giant Monsters, Earth's Greatest Battle. This is the iconic introduction of King Ghidorah, who is one of the most iconic bad guys in Godzilla, to the point where he has shown up in every era possible. And it's amazing. Personal favorite, highly recommend checking this one out. And it is available as part of the Godzilla Showa Era set from Criterion, as well as available on streaming. 1965, Frankenstein Conquers the World, also known as Frankenstein vs. Underground Monster Baragon. 1965 had Invasion of Astro Monster, also known as the Giant Monster War, an odd Godzilla title that doesn't have Godzilla in the title, but this is another film and is the next step after the attack by King Ghidorah, and starts throwing together more than just two kaiju. It's just like a party in there now. And it's also available on that Showa box set, as well as on streaming. 1966 had War of the Gargantuas, also known as Frankenstein's Monsters, Sanda vs. Gyra. This was released in the dual pack with Rodan most recently, but it's way out of print. Harder movie to find, but this is a sequel to Frankenstein vs. Baragon, and sees two monsters going up face to face against each other. 1966 also saw Ebirah, Horror of the Deep, also known as Godzilla, Ebirah, and Mothra, Big Duel in the South Seas. Now this film, interestingly, was originally going to star King Kong, but that was moved to another film, and Godzilla was taken the slot instead. And in 1967, King Kong Escapes, also known as King Kong's Counterattack, saw the return of Toho's King Kong, going up against the threatening Mechani-Kong. And this one plays with a lot of elements that were existing in the King Kong mythos. Like, for example, in the original film, he climbs the Empire State Building. In this film, he climbs Tokyo Tower. So, you know, it's adapting it to Japan. Now, unfortunately, only the English edit release has been released in North America on Blu-ray and DVD, and I don't know if it's streaming, but that's because of Universal. The original Japanese version hasn't been officially released, though you can find it with some internet digging. 1967's Son of Godzilla, also known as Monster Island's Decisive Battle, Godzilla's Son. Could you believe they introduced Godzilla's son? Based on the title, it's obvious, but Manila here is adorable and fun, and this is kind of a lighter, wackier version of the Godzilla concept, and it all takes place on the monster island that was established in previous movies. 1968 saw one of the most iconic films destroy all monsters, also known as Monsters All Out Attack. This film brought together all of the kaiju we had seen prior, with some minor exceptions here and there. But if you've been watching the movies up to this point, it's a heck of a ride. Now, in 1969, we saw All Monsters Attack, Godzilla, Gabra, Manila All Monsters Attack, which is a movie that sort of plays like a clip show. Toho financially wasn't doing so hot anymore, and this movie sort of relies on existing footage. But it is still worth watching as there is a new plot involved. Now, in 1970, we got Space Amoeba, which is the English title for the very long Gezora Ganami and Kameba Decisive Battle Giant Monsters of the South Seas. This is kind of a neat little film that is inserted in an era where they were kind of focusing in only on Godzilla movies. 1971's Godzilla vs. Hedorah has a strong environmental message, as the monster is literally toxic waste brought to life, and it is one of the most iconic films for a lot of reasons. In 1972, we got Godzilla vs. Gigan, also known as Earth Destructive Directive Godzilla vs. Gigan. So this film sees Godzilla go up against the new monster Gigan, as well as the newly constructed Godzilla Park. 1973 saw Godzilla vs. Megalon, a film that's not only iconic for Godzilla fighting a giant bug, but for introducing Jet Jaguar, who is a robot that acts suspiciously like Ultraman, a series that had been popping off in popularity at the time. 1973 saw the series Zone Fighter, lasting for 26 episodes. This was Toho's answer to Tsuburaya's Ultraman and Toei's Kamen Rider, both series that had sort of reinvented the Daikaiju genre into the Henshin Hero genre, and Zone Fighter takes a lot of cues from that while being able to be a chance to reuse some assets from the Godzilla films. It was sort of Toho's last attempt at really reclaiming a space that they lost out to Ultraman, and it's kind of interesting to see how the series progresses. However, it's never had an official English release, and that makes it hard to find to this day. In 1974, we saw Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, introducing the iconic Mechagodzilla. Yes, in fact, for those that don't know their history, Mechanicong existed before Mechagodzilla, so, you know, maybe Godzilla's copying Kong again. They share things back and forth all the time. And the final Toho Showa Era Universe film, 1975's Terror of Mechagodzilla, also known as Mechagodzilla's Counterattack. This film is the iconic ending to this era of Godzilla films that have been running for the last 20 years. And that concludes the longest running era of any Godzilla or probably any kaiju franchise. 20 years, almost completely straight, with 2 or 3 movies a year. It is one of the largest cinematic universes that existed before we even had that term, only rivaled by Universal's classic monsters. So while all this was happening in the 1960s, what was King Kong's response on the American side while all these Kaiju films were coming out in Japan? Welcome to the chapter known as the Dead Space, because there's just stuff in between things, and this is where we're putting them all. In 1966, The King Kong Show aired. For 3 seasons and a total of 26 episodes, this was a co-production between Videograph International and Toei Animation. But this show was essentially kind of your Saturday morning cartoon of the 60s, and was pretty much the only King Kong thing happening outside of Toho Studios. But not to be outdone, with the ending of the Showa Godzilla era, suddenly a new King Kong film existed. 1976's King Kong. Now, this film is a remake of the 1933 film, however placing it in the present day of 1976. That means everybody's got 70s hair, and the Empire State Building was swapped out for the World Trade Center, which feels weird in hindsight. But this film itself is actually a really cool reimagining of the Kong story. It has a lot of the same similar beats. However, it does work as a standalone piece and doesn't feel like it's rehashing the 1933 movie. The film has been released on DVD and Blu-ray, Blu-ray by Shout Factory, and a new 4K by Paramount Pictures themselves. This is an easy-to-find film at this point in time, though for a while it wasn't. And 10 years later, in 1986, the film received a sequel called King Kong Lives, which, spoilers, King Kong dies at the end of the movie, and then it turns out he's actually alive, and he gets a heart transplant by a doctor played by Linda Hamilton. This movie is incredibly strange, but it's really interesting if you like kind of bad movies. This is also a movie that has been released recently by Australia's Umbrella Entertainment onto Blu-ray, so it is more available, again, than it was a few years ago. So yeah, King Kong Lives. If you liked the 1976 King Kong and just felt like you needed more, that's right there for you. Now, in 1978, 2 years after that King Kong movie, I don't want to say broke box office records, but definitely got attention, there was a co-production between Toho and Hanna-Barbera, Godzilla. It lasted for 2 seasons and 26 episodes, and features Godzilla as the title character, and every other monster that appears is a brand new creation by the Hanna-Barbera Studios, including Godzilla's new son, Godzuki. I'm just assuming it's his son. I didn't actually look that up, so correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But there is an interesting dynamic here. Again, plays like Saturday Morning, and I can't figure out if this is response to King Kong 76 or the King Kong show from the 60s, or just Toho wanted someone else to put the work in to make a Godzilla thing. However, after this period of time, something would emerge. Something new, something fresh, a new era of Godzilla, the Versus Era. So now to preface this, I'm calling this era the Versus Era. It has erroneously been named by the fandom in times where, people didn't know things as the Heisei era, which doesn't make sense because two films aren't even in the Heisei era of Japan history, and there's movies after this that came out in the Heisei era. I like to call this the Versus Era because outside of the first movie, every other movie has Versus in the title. So this era starts off with 1984's The Return of Godzilla, also known as Godzilla. This is a sequel to Godzilla. For the future reference, Godzilla 1954 is the first movie, Godzilla 84 is the sequel, and I will refer to it as Return of Godzilla from here on out. This film is a sequel to 1954 Godzilla in the sense that it ignores everything that came after it. So you watch 54 Godzilla, then you jump to Return of Godzilla. Keep in mind that they do not include anything that happened after 1954 in the timeline to this movie, so it's kind of a fresh start. This film has actually had an interesting history where it didn't have a DVD release in the time where all the other movies were having DVD releases, and Kraken Releasing did a Blu-ray and DVD release, a few years ago, but that seems out of print. There is talks, though, of this film getting re-picked up for licensing, so hopefully it'll be easier to find in the future. Now, 5 years later, in 1989, Godzilla vs. Biollante came out, which would establish the trend of the Versus era going forward. Godzilla versus Monster. Now, Biollante being a new monster was great. I love the idea behind it. It's a flower-based monster, something you don't normally see. This film has been released on DVD and Blu-ray by Miramax multiple times, however currently out of print and not available for streaming, so good luck. At least there's been enough official versions out there, it shouldn't be too hard to find. Now, unfortunately, Biollante made money, but not a ton of money, so the next film would reuse a Showa monster with 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, introducing a new version of King Ghidorah and the most insane time travel plot I have yet to see in a movie. This film also would continue the trend and really start up the let's reinvent the Showa monsters, which would be followed up in 1992's Godzilla vs. Mothra, also known as Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth, this movie being a new imagining of Mothra, really hammering in that they're not using the old Showa continuity. These two films were released on a Blu-ray combo pack by Sony most recently. You can still find it in some places, though I think it is officially out of print, and they have had previous DVD releases singly, and should be not too hard to find, and maybe getting re-released in the near future. And then the next film was Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, showing a new interpretation of Mechagodzilla. Also of note, the English title for this movie is officially Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. I hate that title for two reasons. One, that's not the title of the movie in Japan. Two, it's actually the third Mechagodzilla movie, and three, it's not in the same continuity of the previous two Mechagodzilla movies. You could have just called it Godzilla vs. Super Mechagodzilla if you really wanted to make it different, but this is Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla in 1993. And in 1994, we saw Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, which saw a new monster, in the form of Space Godzilla, who's like giant jerk Godzilla from space. And you also introduce properly Godzilla Jr., a new son for Godzilla, who's not Manila, but a little bit different of a guy. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla were sold together as a Blu-ray combo pack. They did have individual DVDs, though I do think they're currently out of print. You should not have too much trouble finding them, however. In 1995, Toho decided to end the Godzilla series for good, with Godzilla vs. Destroya. This is an incredibly sad movie, and I want to prep you in advance. If you love Godzilla, this one's probably going to hurt you. This movie was to be the end of the Godzilla franchise. However, as we know, that was not the case. They were making plans at the time to make an American Godzilla film, and Toho thought, well, we've made enough of these. We should let someone else do it. We'll be circling back to this in a future segment of this video. Godzilla vs. Destroya was part of a combo pack with Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, a movie from a completely different era of films, but was done by Sony. Same thing with the others, had a single DVD release. It should be easily found online, but, currently it's kind of out of print. Now, with the Godzilla series having ended, where do we go from here? What happens in the 90s? Because that can't be the end of the series, right? Welcome to the late 90s and the early 2000s. it's going to be an adventure. So with the Godzilla series having ended, Toho decided to rebirth Mothra with Rebirth of Mothra in 1996. This is kind of a remake of the first Mothra movie. It sort of connects to the Mothra that appeared in the Versus era, and it kind of works standalone as well. You could honestly just jump in and watch the Rebirth of Mothra trilogy on its own. The film did well, and in 1997 we got Rebirth of Mothra 2, Battle Under the Deep Sea. Another film featuring Mothra, but no Godzilla in sight, which I think is one of my favorite parts about this. It was nice to return to Mothra being a solo character. And in 1998, Rebirth of Mothra 3, Invasion of King Ghidorah, saw King Ghidorah going up against Mothra, and it's a really exciting time. The Rebirth of Mothra trilogy is great. I do highly recommend it, even as a standalone piece. It is available on Blu-ray through Sony. They put a trilogy pack out. This was the first time that 3 was released, and I would recommend looking for this because I'm not sure if these movies are going to get picked up again, but hopefully this is available online, or you can find the Blu-ray itself. Now, 1998 was a big year for both Godzilla and Kong. Godzilla had Godzilla, the 1998 TriStar Pictures release. This was a remake of the original Godzilla premise, setting it in 1998. I almost feel like there was some inspiration from 1976 Kong going into how do we adapt Godzilla, but this is an American-produced Godzilla film with American actors set in New York City. This movie is famously not well received and did not do well at the box office, and people don't generally like it, but, it exists. It's kind of fun. There's actually a reason to watch this, we'll talk about in a moment, but you are looking for it. It has been released on Blu-ray, 4K, DVD, VHS, maybe Laserdisc? Or is Laserdisc dead by then? Can't remember. But it's widely available. You can definitely find this film. But the reason I say you should still watch this is because it spawned a sequel TV animated series, Godzilla the Series, which lasted for 40 episodes. And this series saw an expansion on that universe and gave us one of the coolest interpretations of Godzilla with some really awesome animation and styling. Plus, brand new monster designs that are super duper cool. This series has been released multiple times by Mill Creek Entertainment on DVD on a complete set, and yeah, you can find it pretty easily. I think it's even on streaming. It's worth watching, and I think it's probably the best thing to come out of that 1998 movie, but yeah, I highly recommend looking for the series at least, because the series is really cool. Meanwhile, on the Kong front, 1998's The Mighty Kong, an animated musical remake of the original 1933 film. I think I told you everything you need to know about that one. I mean, it exists, but holy cow, is that something weird. It hasn't been around a while, release-wise or streaming-wise. You're gonna have to dig for this one, but musical Kong. Yeah, that's a thing. Now, because of the success of Godzilla series, Kong decided he needed to get in there. Kong the Animated Series started airing in 2000 as a response to that series and lasted for 40 episodes. This sort of acts as a sequel to the 1933 film in a lot of ways, and it's actually kind of interesting that both Godzilla and Kong got 40-episode runs on TV shows in the late 90s, early 2000s era. Now, this series did not quite wrap up its plot before cancellation. However, unlike Godzilla the series, which never got a continuation, Kong the Animated Series did. In 2005, Kong King of Atlantis was released to tie into the upcoming Peter Jackson film, and that continues the plot of Kong the Animated Series. And then in 2006, there was Kong Return of the Jungle, a 3D CGI sequel movie to King of Atlantis that sort of works standalone but has the same characters, so it's all one continuity. Kind of interesting. Kong got a continuation, but Godzilla didn't. Now, with the failure of the 1998 Godzilla film, Toho realized we can't just pass this off to anybody, and resurrected Godzilla for the Millennium Era. The Millennium Era of Godzilla is an interesting one because this is not so interconnected as the Versus Era or the Showa eras before it. In fact, almost every one of these movies is a sequel to 1954 Godzilla. Starting with 1999's Godzilla 2000 Millennium. Everybody was getting really excited. It was turn of millennium, and a lot of movies got named 2000, even if they weren't sequels. This one technically is. This film is a sequel to the 1954 Godzilla and sets up its own continuity that ignores all the prior films that have come since. This film was released on a single release by Sony as they produced an English version themselves. They were really hyped up on this thing because they wanted to pick up from where Godzilla 1998 failed. And it has gone out of print, but it should be available to find because it's been released many, many times over the years. In 2000, we got Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, the G-Annihilation Strategy, seeing a brand new monster in the form of Megaguirus, and this is also a sequel to 1954's Godzilla, ignoring 2000, ignoring the Versus Era, ignoring the Showa era. It's just its own other sequel. This film was released in a dual pack with Godzilla vs. Destroya and is, like the others, still kind of available, even if it's not currently in print. 2001's Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah All-Out Giant Monster Attack is another sequel to 1954's Godzilla. However, unlike the other sequels to 1954's Godzilla, which eventually turns Godzilla from rampaging monster into heroic character, this movie keeps Godzilla as the dead-set villain and flip-flops all the other monsters to be the good guys. It's amazing. When you have had this many movies for Godzilla, flipping the script like this is fantastic and it's great to see. Plus, it has my favorite Godzilla design of all time in it. This film was released on a combo pack with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, much like the others, still kind of available, but, you know, not hard to find. Now, in 2002, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, technically the fourth Mechagodzilla movie, and the third continuity, is another sequel to 1954 Godzilla, where Godzilla reemerges and a new Mechagodzilla must be born, this one being called Kiryu. This is a film that was so successful, it spawned an actual sequel. It's 2003's Godzilla, Mothra, Mechagodzilla, Tokyo SOS. These are the only two Millennium Era films to be connected together, and they are connected to the original 1954 Godzilla, making a trilogy of sorts, which is kind of really cool. Now, unfortunately, when they were released on Blu-ray, Against Mechagodzilla was with GMK, and Tokyo SOS was with Final Wars, so the two movies that actually go together aren't in the same set, which is kind of a bummer. And to celebrate Godzilla's 50th anniversary, 2004's Godzilla Final Wars establishes a brand new continuity not connected to any previous Godzilla film, but featuring almost every single monster that has ever appeared throughout the franchise, including 1998's Zilla. Godzilla Final Wars was released on Blu-ray with Tokyo SOS and is still available in a lot of places, even if it's currently out of print. And this is the movie you watch when you're definitely a Godzilla fan. I don't recommend it as a starting point unless you just want to get thrown into the deep end and see the most insane thing that you've ever seen, because even Godzilla fans think this one's a little much. After this film, though, Toho demolished the water tank that they filmed Godzilla going into the ocean with and said, "We're done. Godzilla will not be made by us ever again." That would turn out to be not true, but let's see what King Kong had in response to the Godzilla Millennium Era. So in the 2000s, 2005's King Kong by Lord of the Rings director Peter Jackson. He loved the original 1933 King Kong and gave it a full-blown modern remake, still set in 1933. This one was interesting is that it is a period piece. It's not set in present day like the 76 King Kong was, and is our third remake of that original story, but this one is skewing closer to the original film. However, it is much longer, much more elaborate, and much bigger. Plus, it was produced by Universal, who kept holding on to King Kong rights like a death grip, but they finally actually made their own movie. This film has been released on DVD, Blu-ray, and various digital formats multiple times, and does feature an extended cut, which for some reason fixes the pacing of the movie. Like, you think, I felt like the first time I watched it, it was too long on the theatrical, but then the extended cut, which is longer, just felt better. I don't know, take your pick, but there are two cuts of the movie out there. All right, and so let's see what else was in the 2000s. That was it. On to the 2010s. In 2014, a new Godzilla film was released, 10 years after Final Wars, known as Godzilla 2014. This one was produced by Legendary Pictures in association with Warner Brothers and was featuring a license from Toho. Now, we're not going to talk about this yet because this spawned the MonsterVerse, which is the current connected universe of Godzilla and Kong projects. And so I thought, instead of going through the order they came out in, let's go in the order these stories take place in. Because honestly, the way they set these up, you can kind of just watch them in the chronological order for the timeline of the productions, as opposed to how they were released. So let's start with 2017's Kong Skull Island, taking place in 1973 at the end of the Vietnam War. This film takes place entirely on Skull Island, introducing us to a new Kong, one who's similar in size, maybe a little bit bigger than classic King Kong, but he's still growing. And that is where we get some interesting stuff. This establishes a lot of lore and a lot of connections to the organization known as Monarch, who track and follow the Titans, which are their term for kaiju, in this universe. And it sees a lot of interesting characters that will continue into other projects. We also get the introduction to Kong. It's very essential for that reason, but it's the early point in the timeline that we have as a standalone production. Kong Skull Island has been released on Blu-ray, 4K, DVD. digital platforms, and is available on streaming from several places. It's easy to find when you want to look for it. In 2023, the animated series Skull Island, which lasted for 8 episodes, takes place in the 1990s. It sees a group of people going to Skull Island to investigate and look for clues and learn things about the island, and it does not just feature Kong, but other creatures of Skull Island, and kind of expands out that universe a bit. The series has only 8 episodes. It aired exclusively on Netflix. There was plans for a season 2, but we haven't heard if that's still happening, so at the moment it is just an 8-episode series. This leads us to Godzilla in 2014, taking place in 2014. This movie sees Godzilla emerging in the present day of 2014, and sees his first emergence onto land where people will actually see him, fundamentally changing the MonsterVerse's trajectory, where the monsters have been kept contained and hidden from the public up to this point. The Monarch organization is tracking Godzilla and finding out that Godzilla may not be the destructive monster that everyone thinks he is. This film, of course, has been released multiple times. Do I highly recommend the 4K Blu-ray release, as they recolor graded the film and adjust the brightness levels. The first release of the movie was incredibly dark and hard to see, but this new 4K, which comes with a Blu-ray, actually has it a bit corrected. But the movie is available on streaming and other digital platforms. It's pretty easy to find. 2023's Monarch Legacy of Monsters was a 10-episode series that takes place in 2015. It sees the aftermath of Godzilla 2014 and sets up things we would see in future MonsterVerse stories, as well as flashbacks into different time periods, seeing how the legacy of monsters plays out, from Godzilla to Kong, from the seas to Skull Island and beyond. This series is a character-driven thing, so don't go into it expecting monster battles every single scene. It is also incredibly narratively dense, so it's a show you gotta pay attention to. It's streamed exclusively on Apple TV Plus and currently isn't available outside of that, but this series is a chapter in the MonsterVerse itself, showing the Monarch and the human side of the conflicts. 2019 saw Godzilla King of the Monsters, a sequel to Godzilla 2014. This movie introduces us to King Ghidorah, Mothra, and Rodan, bringing those classic Toho Kaiju into the world of the MonsterVerse. This film is, yet again, very easy to find. It is available on Blu-ray, DVD, 4K, streaming, digital, all that good stuff. And it is an essential piece to the story, as this sees the emergence of titans that you think would eventually have to get Kong's attention. And get his attention it did, because 2021's Godzilla vs. Kong, taking place in 2024, is a film that puts Godzilla and Kong together, what the MonsterVerse was building up to this whole time. An all-out brawl between two guys that are totally not going to work together at the end of the movie, right? They're not going to pull a Goku and Vegeta on us. Anyways, Godzilla vs. Kong is, of course, an important step. This also is probably the most action figure monstery, throw monsters at each other kind of movie of the MonsterVerse, and I think that's what makes it really fun, and I think that's why it was successful. Of course, released on 4K, Blu-ray, digital, DVD, streaming, it's out there. You can find Godzilla vs. Kong. And this leads us to 2024's Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, seeing a follow-up of the events that came through Godzilla vs. Kong. Now, this movie is, of course, a new release. I have not seen it yet as time of recording, so I don't know where in the timeline it places, but it is sometime after Godzilla vs. Kong. And that, so far, is the MonsterVerse, which I hope continues. I especially want another season of Monarch. That was pretty awesome. Now, this category is everything else that exists in the present day outside of the MonsterVerse, and it's just kind of a bunch of standalone projects. So let's go through them. 2016's Kong King of the Apes, a 26-episode, 2-season series that was an animated show on Netflix with a CG animation style, completely unrelated to the MonsterVerse, just like another Kong series, conveniently coming out right before and ending right after Kong Skull Island. Definitely not a coincidence. The rights to Kong are, kind of up there where like anybody can use them almost, so it's one of those things. But that's a nice little standalone project. Also in 2016, Shin Godzilla, proving that Toho does not mean it when they say they're done making Godzilla movies. This was a Toho-produced movie 12 years after Godzilla Final Wars, and sees famed filmmaker Hideaki Anno take his approach to Godzilla, and especially with the social commentary to recent events in Japan. This movie is standalone, but it has been connected sort of in marketing to Shin Evangelion, Shin Kamen Rider, and Shin Ultraman, though they are not a connected universe. Shin Godzilla is a standalone movie. Shin Godzilla, however, did get a Blu-ray and DVD release. However, I think it's out of print, but hopefully it'll be available in the future. There are some places that may be streaming it, but it's a little bit harder to find than you'd think for being a high-profile movie. In 2017, Toho paired with Polygon Pictures and Netflix to produce the Godzilla Monster Planet trilogy of animated films. In 2017, Godzilla Part 1, Planet of the Monsters, sees a world where Godzilla was left on Earth while humanity walked away. They went into space and they came back. And it's interesting to see what came from that. In 2018, we got Part 2, City on the Edge of Battle, which saw a new interpretation of Mechagodzilla. And later that year, we got Part 3, The Planet Eater, seeing a new interpretation of King Ghidorah. These three films have some interesting ideas and some different concepts than what you'd expect from a normal Godzilla fare. In 2021, another animated series was produced, Godzilla Singular Point, lasting for 12 episodes. This series was an anime series produced for Netflix worldwide, and it does feature new characters and kind of takes a more Showa-esque approach, bringing back characters such as Jet Jaguar. So it's kind of an interesting sort of investigation type show, less so than just like, let's have Godzilla always fight. They do some interesting things with Godzilla in this series as well. And in 2023, we had the Oscar-winning Godzilla -1 released in most places in the world. For some reason, they didn't release it in Southeast Asia, and Toho should get on that. More people should be allowed to see this movie. This is a standalone film, but takes an approach of Godzilla in a different time period, him emerging post-World War II as opposed to all the way in the 1950s. And this is a heck of an emotional film. And on top of that, it takes the approach of putting the human characters first and Godzilla being a part of that story as opposed to the kaiju being the focus. And for now, that is all the media for Godzilla and Kong. So that does it. That is the history and the watch orders for Godzilla and Kong throughout cinematic history. I think it's really interesting to see how they kind of complement each other. Usually when one reemerges, the other pops up, and vice versa. Sometimes they pop up in gaps between each other, sometimes at the exact same time. It's pretty interesting. Like, I don't know if it's a coincidence or if just how that happened, but like Godzilla Final Wars coming out in 2004 and then there being a new King Kong movie in 2005 being the exact same way that like Terror of Mechagodzilla was 74 and then 76 Kong had a new movie. They always seem to match each other, and I think that's why the MonsterVerse, rightfully so, pitted them against each other as rivals, because they have been throughout the cinematic history of the planet. And so because of that, I liked in doing this guide for that. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. I know that I went over a lot of information, I tried to keep it streamlined. If you're wondering about specific details on things that I may not have covered, hit me up in the comments as well. And if you haven't hit the like button and subscribe and notification bell already, I'd appreciate if you do that. Please consider joining as a channel member for as little as $1 a month. There are perks like its early access, member-only live streams, all kinds of cool stuff. Check the details down below at the join button. It helps support the channel directly and allows us to continue to do videos like this, so I appreciate all the support from our channel members. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can check out our Discord server in the link below, or you can come join the Monday live streams on this YouTube channel every Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. They're open to everybody, and you can chat if you're a subscriber. If you want to find me elsewhere, I am on most social media platforms at Soundout12, though I am more active in those live streams and on Discord. Plus, you can find my awesome graphic designer on Discord and social media at DarkClaw643, and you can find Hero Club at hero-club.com for Tokusatsu news, interviews, and more. And until next time, this is Soundout saying, let them fight.